Hi everybody, and welcome to our first video, which deals with the concept of myth. We're going to be talking today about mythology and myth in general in terms of its definition, to try and get an idea as to how it plays an important role in cultures, both ancient and modern, and get a context for reading our creation myths. So let's get started. First of all, we have to define this word. And I think that you can't talk about myth without talking about its two very distinct, very different possible definitions. In our culture, when we hear that word myth or we read the word myth, we definitely see it associated with a more negative connotation. It is often used to represent a falsehood, some kind of widely held but false belief or idea that a lot of people have. So using it in myths that undermine educational effectiveness. So these are mistruths or things that are not real. Or perhaps you've read the 10 running myths that are slowing you down. So if you're still, running barefoot or eating glucosamine or grinding out junk miles, it's time to heed the latest science and let go of those old, very untrue falsehoods. So that's kind of the way we see myth represented in our current culture. And, that is a valid definition. More important, I think, is this quote-unquote old meaning of myth. Before we had running myths or educational myths, this meant a traditional story concerning the early history of a people or an explanation of natural phenomena. Now, does that mean that these things are not necessarily true? Well, to answer that question, you would have to say, depends on the person. These are belief systems, and even though we associate a negative connotation with the word myth in our current culture, myth can refer to a core religious belief that people have, and we don't necessarily want to use that word to mean an untruth, because what is true to the core of your being is very important, and it's part of your culture, and we don't want that to sound like a falsehood or a widely held belief that's not true. So we use myth in this particular section of our instruction to mean some kind of traditional story. And we want to make sure that we respect that all different people have different core belief systems, and that perhaps the myths of each individual culture are just as important as those of another. You cannot talk about myth without talking about the man, Joseph Campbell. And he is very important when we discuss mythology, because he was not only an ardent consumer of ancient and modern cultures, but he was the foremost author on mythology. He had written a plethora of books on the topic, and he's the go-to guy when you talk about mythology. He also pioneered this concept of the monomyth, and I'm sure you are having no trouble figuring out what a monomyth is, because you can see we have that root mono, meaning one or man, and then myth, okay? So this is like a singular, central myth that all humans become a part of, okay? It's really a structure for which many myths follow. And he also talked about the journey of the hero and how adventure plays into our mythology and our culture and the really important values that each and every one of us hold. So it's important to understand also that many, many religious and important cultural figures have stories that follow this structure, this monomyth, or journey of the hero. So here's a page from Hero with a Thousand Faces, and Joseph Campbell here illustrates how the hero sets forth to go on an adventure and all of the different parts of that journey that may play in. Of it, we have a hiker. And you can see the cycle of the hero's journey. It's cyclical. It repeats. It returns from whence it came. And so many different movies, stories, poetry, ancient and modern, follow this structure. I think perhaps the most well-known journey of the hero story is probably Star Wars. And George Lucas was very open about the fact that, he was inspired by Joseph Campbell and he created his own mythology. I also want to share with you this excerpt from Hero with a Thousand Faces because he says something very interesting about mythology. He kind of lists all the different ways that mythology has been interpreted by the modern intellect, okay? So he's talking about people today reading stories of the traditional manner from way back when and how they interpret them. So is it, as this one author says, a fumbling effort to explain nature? Is it poetical fantasy from prehistoric times? So is it some kind of fiction that prehistoric people created to entertain themselves that succeeding ages misunderstood and thus decided to take as creed? Is it just a repository, okay, or a place to put all these allegorical or storytelling instructions so that the individual could be shaped to his group or his society? Is it a group dream, meaning that all of our collective consciousness believes or fears the same things, as the psychologist Jung would say? Is it a traditional vehicle of our most profound insights? Is it God's revelation to his children as the church, and he's referring to the Catholic Church, but he could also be speaking about many different religions? Is it God's revelation to his children? Well, Campbell sums it up. Mythology, it's all of these things. All of these are determined by the viewpoints of the judges. That means that, as we've been saying all along, perception is everything, and what you believe comes from your subjective experience. Campbell believed that this didn't mean that myth was unimportant. In fact, he thought it was very, very important. He thought it was important for everybody to understand. He writes here that what is the core of us? What is the character of our being? So he's digging back not just into recent history, but ultimately he's talking about what are humans made out of, and how do our myths influence who we are and this core of us as humans, all humans throughout time, throughout cultures. He also makes a really, really beautiful closing statement here when he talks about this modern hero. Now, this could be a fictional character, but he could also be referring to the modern individual. So you, me, anyone who dares to heed the call and seek the mansion of that presence, with whom it is our whole destiny to be atoned. And he says, we must not wait, we cannot wait for our community to cast off its pride or fear or misunderstanding. He quotes Nietzsche by saying, live as though the day were here. So Joseph Campbell very much believed in destiny or fate, and he thought that there were hands kind of helping us along this pathway to happiness or to bliss, and that all we had to do was take those first steps to cross that threshold and become a hero of our own story. So I hope today that you've gained of mythology and myth and what it means. It's definitely a very, very deep understanding of our primal, very, very old, ancient roots as humans. And he summarizes his entire book by saying that all of these elements, these social forms of the prehistoric, primitive and historic man, discoveries in science and technology and dreams, they all boil up, or they all descend from myth. So lest you think that the age of mythology is over, you are wrong, because we continue to create and adapt and enjoy myths even today. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope it helped you a little bit with myth, and in our next lesson we are going to read some creation myths. See you soon.